a railroad, a killer, a robber, a harmonica, and the woman caught between them. This is how the Wild West was killed. Just when Sergio Leone thought that he was done with the Western, that he had said all there was to say, reinventing the genre, perfecting his new spaghetti Western approach, and creating a truly massive epic across 3 films, just when he was ready for something totally different, Hollywood finally came calling, and Leone was pulled back into the land of cowboys, shootouts, and a lawless frontier with 1968's Once Upon a Time in the West. Despite being obsessed with the Western since he was a young boy, Leone was ready to move on, and his continued disillusionment in Hollywood, the Western, and America led to a film that was made to kill off the Western permanently and yet still continue its myth. The result is a film that acts as a capstone to nearly a half-century of movies, and yet was so successful that it inspired another 50 years of Westerns. It's a film that shares many of the same hallmarks in its cinematography, score, and approach to both violence and morality as the Dollars trilogy. But make no mistake, Once Upon a Time in the West is Sergio Leone once again finding a brand new approach to what had seemed like a worn-out genre, ultimately using it as a weapon against the genre itself. This is the story of Once Upon a Time in the West, how Sergio Leone killed the Western. Over the history of my channel, I have covered 3 of Leone's previous films, all 3 of the Dollars trilogy, including A Fistful of Dollars for a few dollars more, and of course my favorite movie of all time, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. But making 3 massive westerns in the span of 3 years led to Leone being done with the genre and ready to move on. And at the same time, Hollywood finally came calling. But despite Leone thinking this was his grand opportunity to make something completely different, studios had a different idea. By 1966, Leone was already set on making his dream project, an adaptation of Harry Gray's book, The Hoods, which depicts his life as a Jewish gangster during Prohibition in New York. But no one was willing to finance the picture, with studios like United Artists only wanting another Western. Leone would eventually make The Hoods into Once Upon a Time in America in 1984, but for now, the director agreed to make another cowboy picture with Paramount when the studio offered him the chance to work with his favorite actor, Henry Fonda. And so, throughout 1966, Leone collaborated with directors Bernardo Bertolucci and Dario Argento, still super early into both of their careers and before Argento had even directed a film, to crack a story culled from watching copious amounts of American westerns, before taking the story and having the script written by Sergio Donati, who had worked on for a few dollars more. The result was Once Upon a Time in the West. Released in Italy in 1968 and the US in 1969, a massive film running close to 3 hours long that focuses on one woman, Jill McBain, who arrives in the Wild West town of Flagstone to reunite with her new husband and his widowed family, only to find that they've all been murdered in a conspiracy to take his land. We soon come to find out that the McBains were wiped out on the orders of railroad tycoon Mr. Morton and carried out by vicious killer Frank. And this outbreak of violence draws the outlaw Cheyenne, framed for the murders, and the mysterious Harmonica, looking for revenge on Frank for unknown reasons. And so, with Jill at the center of 3 men who each have their own reasons for pursuing her, the question becomes who will win this power struggle, and how will they shape the future of America? Leone once called his films fairy tales for grown-ups, and specifically that his approach was to keep a grounded, real-world setting and fill it with larger-than-life characters and huge stories to create myths that had a push and pull with history and human morality. It fits with his own fairy tale-like view of America and his slow disillusionment with it as a nation. Born in 1929, Leone and his parents, also part of the Italian film industry, lived under the fascistic rule of Benito Mussolini in his youth, with the director recalling that his first exposure to Americans was through the heroic US military entering the country as Mussolini was defeated. In that moment, a heroic, mythic view of the United States was formed in not just Leone, but in many Italians at the time, with the director saying, "One of the first loves of Italians who grew up in the 1930s was America. Like all first loves, it may well be seen from a different point of view after the event, but it is never forgotten." And that was given to us by Hollywood, especially the epic of the West. A love of America, an obsession with Western movies, especially those of John Ford, and a burgeoning film career that started when he dropped out of law school when he was 18, set Leone on a path to eventually make a Western. But by the time he was working in Italy's film industry, the cowboy story was already a thing of the past in America and had not yet been translated to Italy's film industry because, well, Leone hadn't done it yet. At the same time, Leone's work on sword and sandal epics in Italy like The Last Days of Pompeii brought him into collaboration with various American filmmakers who had crafted many of the westerns he loved. And yet, whenever Leone would bring up their past work, he'd be met with the same outlook again and again. The Western is dead. I was more in love with the idea of the American West than anyone you could imagine, said Leone. I had read everything I could on the conquest of the West, already building up a huge archive on the subject. While I organized chariot races, sea battles between triremes, and explosions on galleys, I was silently dreaming of Nevada and New Mexico. Obviously, the Western wasn't dead forever, and it was Leone who revived it with his Dollars trilogy, leading to a massive wave of spaghetti westerns in Italy that were all trying to imitate his style, and a new wave of brutal, more disillusioned westerns in America. But I think there's this complex brew of Leone being ready to move on, and knowing that the Western was only temporarily revived and a different animal than it was before, and ultimately still bound for being obsolete and dead, this is an elegy for the Western instead of a celebration of it. Literally, a lament for the dead. Rhythmically, I think that Once Upon a Time is Leone's most difficult film to get on board with. It's a very slow-paced movie, and that's completely deliberate. Leone has said that he viewed the film as a dance of death, and that he wanted its rhythms and speed to feel like the last breaths of a dying person, reflecting on their life and knowing that the end has finally come before they pass away. So yeah, when I first saw the film after absolutely falling in love with the Dollars trilogy, it was a little hard to get into. I appreciated it and liked aspects of it, but also felt pushed away by its really slow approach and decision to turn the speed down on literally everything. But over the years, I've rewatched this film many times. It's been suited to different moods of mine over the years, my own taste in westerns evolving, my own appreciation for Leone growing over time, and it also being a different approach from the director versus the Dollars trilogy because you can't just watch the same 3 movies over and over again. And as I've begun to learn more and more about the history of the Western, I've also grown in my appreciation of it. But I can also see why this is a difficult movie for a lot of people to get into, and why it had a very mixed reception when it was first premiered, and also why the French, of all people, really loved it. It's a very slow movie, but it is deliberately slow, and once you get on its wavelength, I think that slowness really helps you appreciate the artistry behind it all. Once Upon a Time is shot by cinematographer Tonino Delacoli, who also shot The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and I think he and Leone are perfectly working in sync here. With a bigger budget of $5 million versus the $1.2 million of GBU, the sets and cast can be so much bigger, and Delacoli is able to capture that scope for a grand setting. And of course, the film is filled with the extreme close-ups that juxtapose against ultra-wide vistas to emphasize how these archetypal characters become just as mythic as the Wild West they tame. That increased budget also allowed Leone to film for the first time in the US, and then largely using Spain for exteriors like his spaghetti westerns, and then studios in Rome for interiors. And look at these faces. From the extras to our leads, Leone's film is filled with worn, weathered, emotional characters that really do look like they've just rode out of the desert. Not to turn into a kids these days grouchy guy for a second, but if there's one aspect of movie making that films like these highlight in the contrast between then versus now, it's that today's unhealthy hyperfixation on giving every actor, man or woman, every type of skin treatment, filler, Botox, and plastic surgery for physical perfection has robbed them of both an emotive ability and a believability within their roles. Sure, the people in this film look like an old hot dog that rolled under the couch a week ago, but you believe that old hot dog is a deadly gunslinger. And of course, the entire film is scored by the incomparable Ennio Morricone, who, like Leone's previous films, composed and recorded his score before the film was actually shot because the director wanted to make the film with the full score in mind and often played on set during takes. This, like the previous films, melds their tones perfectly. And I think Morricone's score here is really special and relies heavily on creating instantly recognizable, very distinct leitmotifs for each character. Harmonica's theme is, of course, his harmonica, a droning, incessant sound that blends score and diegetic music. Cheyenne's is a tripping banjo that blends with his friendlier, musty image. Frank's theme is an aggressive, ringing electric guitar, cutting through the sonic landscape like a bullet. And Jill's theme, tellingly, is the main theme of the film. A sweeping, mournful piece that uses a wordless lament by singer Etta Del Rosso, who also sang on The Ecstasy of Gold, to represent the new world in the aftermath of the old world's death. The original Italian title of C'era una volta il West translates literally to Once upon a time, there was the West. And I think that really illustrates this film's point of view. This is the end of an era, a moment in time when modern reality comes crashing down on all the mythic archetypes that populated the Western genre in the decades before, and wipes them away to make room for tomorrow. But it's more complicated than that. This isn't just a straight, grounded subversion of the Western. If you're looking for that, you can find it in Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven, which is all about completely dispelling the mythic lies of the Western with unflinching, messy violence and regret. Instead, Leone's film is depicting the myth, letting it play out in grand, sweeping action, and then bringing it to its inevitable, foregone conclusion. Think of it as akin to Le Mort d'Arthur, The Passing of Robin Hood, or so many elderly superhero stories that finally play out the deaths of mythic, seemingly immortal archetypes. Everybody dies eventually, even people that seem like legends have to pass on. It's a bummer, right? Well, tough shit. Get used to it. And the experience is like this. We know all things pass. We know that heroes and villains all eventually die. We know that bygone eras are gone by because we live in an era that they're no longer with us. It's just that we never actually want to see them pass away. And if we don't have to look at it, then we don't have to really accept it. By reliving the stories of their heyday, they live with us forever. These stories of death force us to come face to face with their passing and to try to make sense of it as people who now live in the aftermath. And what Once Upon a Time in the West is doing is showing us the death of all Westerns that came before. While Leone's previous films clearly dealt in references to and subversions of the decades of Westerns that came before on film, Once Upon a Time is the most indebted to specific films and the most in conversation with them. For the first time ever, Leone was able to film parts of his movie in the United States and, unsurprisingly, made sure to shoot in Monument Valley, showing Jill's journey to her new home as passing through the instantly recognizable mountains seen in countless American Westerns beforehand. Beyond that obvious touchstone, little moments and sequences reference iconic Westerns like High Noon, Shane, The Iron Horse, 3:10 to Yuma, The Searchers. The list actually goes on to a point that it's insane, and so specific and small that it thankfully avoids too much of a wink and a nudge. But the point is that the many mythical, often idyllic depictions of the Wild West are used to formulate this story as what Leone called a kaleidoscopic view of all American Westerns put together. If we think of every different Western movie as all taking place in the same world, only separated by years and miles, then Leone's film acts as the closing chapter to them all. That idea would have been even more apparent and self-reflexive if Leone had been able to make the film's 10-minute opening sequence like he originally envisioned. Here, the film opens with a wordless scene that sees three men silently wait at a train station. No music. Just the monotonous sounds of every little bit of movement as they while away their time until the train comes in, bringing the man they've been waiting for, Harmonica, who proceeds to blast away all three in a lightning-fast duel. It's maybe the ultimate distillation of Leone's use of tension and stillness punctuated by violence, because it just goes on for so long and without telling us what we're waiting for. Here, the three men are played by Woody Strode, Jack Elam, and Al Moloch, who were all mostly known for small supporting roles in past westerns. By casting them here, Leone is leveraging and then killing off the specters of the past. But originally, he wanted the three to be played by Clint Eastwood, Lee Van Cleef, and Eli Wallach, the star trio of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, making his destruction of the Western even more obvious and tongue-in-cheek. Wallach agreed to do it, Van Cleef was too busy, his career now revitalized by Leone, but Eastwood, having issues with Leone and not wanting to work with him again, turned it down, causing the director to entirely recast the parts. And ultimately, I think that's for the best. Leone and Donati's film uses characters, scenes, settings, and ideas from films that we've come to know to create more of a sense of time and place and setting that becomes familiar to us and lets us realize that this is all happening within the larger setting of all the films that came before, but doesn't play as straight and obvious homage, and that makes the film a lot more subtle and stronger. Let's look at the characters and how they fit into each of these archetypes. Jill McBain, played by Claudia Cardinale, our quite literal central character, as the entire plot and the actions of everyone else revolve around her. While Leone once said that women aren't much of a factor in his films because he's not focused on romance, which I think underlines a weakness of him and Donati as screenwriters, Jill is easily the most complicated and important female character in his filmography. As the new wife of Brett McBain and the owner of the plot-centric Plot of Land, Jill changes from a former prostitute desperate for survival to the embodiment of civilization and the future of America. Harmonica, played by Charles Bronson, our mysterious man with no name with revenge on his mind. The most akin to Eastwood's Dollars Trilogy character, Harmonica similarly is unknowable and bound to violence, and the nameless gunslinger blowing into town and setting things right. The big difference here is that he's much more personally tied to everything happening, as his quest for vengeance motivates him above all else. Cheyenne, played by Jason Robards, a Native American trickster outlaw with a secret heart of gold. Yes, played by a white guy, typical for the time and for Leone's movies. While Cheyenne is at first introduced as a desperate scoundrel, we come to see that he's the most morally upright and motivated to help Jill. With Robards playing his age, Cheyenne clearly becomes a relic of the past. But instead of trying to prevent the future, he helps shepherd it along for a brighter path. Frank, played by Henry Fonda, the outright villain and maybe the most evil character in Leone's westerns. Frank is another relic of the Wild West, but one of pure hatred and violence. A straight-up, literal black hat killer who's left a long trail of bodies behind him, who now realizes that the world is changing and about to leave him behind. Frank's ambition is to become a powerful businessman, but his killer ways can't truly change and bring about retribution he can't outrun. Mr. Morton, played by Gabriel Frazzetti, the train baron and the powerful magnate causing the film's conflict. The man who is bringing the future, but who ultimately cannot embody it, Morton is in the late stages of tuberculosis that's eating away at his body, making him desperate to complete his transcontinental railroad and see his dreams of reaching the ocean come true, only to leave him stranded in the West and unable to find any sort of conclusion. Many of the actors chosen here are also in conversation with past westerns. Bronson, hired after Eastwood turned it down, came to fame because of The Magnificent Seven and carries that heroic past into a darker role. Robards had similarly been in several previous westerns and gives the best performance in the film, and maybe the best in any Leone movie. But it's Henry Fonda as Frank that truly made waves. At this point in his 60s, Fonda had made a career for himself by playing pillars of morality across decades. 12 Angry Men, perfect movie, in particular being an amazing showcase of Fonda as unshakably good. So casting him as the vile Frank, who is introduced to the film by killing a family and blowing away a young boy, was designed to shock and disturb audiences. In fact, it was so shocking that Fonda, who had been used to bring Leone into Paramount, nearly turned down the role until Eli Wallach vouched for the director and told Fonda that he'd have the time of his life. Part of the power of this film is from Leone bringing together so many different archetypes from westerns of the past that have rarely coexisted within the same story, and by bringing them together, having them clash, and sending them off to their inevitable end, Leone and Donati are attempting to bring the curtain down on the West. And so much of that gives this film a very mournful and elegiac power. And the first hour of Leone's epic is just so sad. It's really tightly focused on Jill's arrival to the West and her mourning of her lost love, the murder of his family, and the immediate desolation of her dreams as soon as she arrives. It's all underscored by Morricone's sweeping elegy as the main theme of the film, which plays over American vistas, funerals, and the unveiling of the West. Thankfully, there are a lot more tones and ideas happening within Once Upon a Time after the first hour. The film becomes much more of an adventure, has a lot more action as its four characters collide, and adds in more humor, mostly thanks to Cheyenne, but even Harmonica has moments of dry comedy. This is Leone's most patient, still film, composing vistas, close-ups, and like all of his films, much more focused on building tension and anticipation than in creating constant spurts of violence. This had always been the case with Leone's approach. All of the action in the Dollars trilogy is based on tense confrontations that await split-second reactions. But the wait is even longer, and in truth, the gunfights are less important. That's not to say they aren't great, but in this case, it's all been done before by the master. Cheyenne's trickster train shootout and the climactic duel between Frank and Harmonica are the gunfight highlights here, but you can't help but feel Leone is ready to move on. He's so ready, in fact, that the biggest, bloodiest, most important gunfight between Cheyenne and Morton's gangs happens entirely off-screen. Alongside that, Leone and Donati's script returns to the recurring usage of moral ambiguity that was mostly contained within the character of the man with no name in the Dollars trilogy, and extends it to almost all of our major characters. Not only that, but their script essentially refuses to provide us with each character's motivations for almost the entirety of the film. See, these are the choices that made this such a difficult watch for me as a teenager, but make it work so well on multiple rewatches in the decades after. And I think that looking at the ultimate end of every character reveals what Leone felt about the Western, its relationship to America, and why these archetypes and stories and era needed to end for the country to be able to progress into the future. Frank is killed by Harmonica in a climactic duel, wanting the showdown after all his dreams have been destroyed, and only finding out why Harmonica wants revenge with his last breath. And that reveals Harmonica's motivations with a flashback. Forced to hold up his hanged brother as a young kid by Frank years ago with a harmonica in his mouth. Riding off at the end, he's neither able to be part of the new world nor able to return to the old one. Cheyenne dies at the very end, passing from a gut shot by Morton he's hidden, and allowing the surviving heroes to create the new world as he dies alone and hidden from Jill, the last relic of the past gone from sight. And that leaves Jill, now in charge of the in-progress station and owner of a soon-to-be booming town. She not only has everything she could dream of, but is the living embodiment of the tamed West and civilized America. If there's any direct parallel, it's to the farmers of Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, the only ones to benefit from the sacrifice and deaths of our heroes, and a symbol that the old ways are dying forever. As far as its release goes, Once Upon a Time in the West was given the same sort of initial reputation and reception that most of Leone's films at first got before and after. While released in its full official runtime of 171 minutes in Italy, the film was at first trimmed down to 165 minutes for an international cut, and then dropped to 140 minutes for its release in the United States. And alongside those versions, Once Upon a Time was a hit in Europe, finding massive success in France and Germany in particular, but a major disappointment in America. Not surprisingly, American critics were dismissive of the film at the time, disliking the continued evolution of Leone's style and his aggressive violence designed to disturb preconceived notions of the West on film. Thankfully, like almost all of Leone's films, Once Upon a Time in the West underwent a huge reappraisal in the decades that followed, receiving praise from modern critics and filmmakers alike, finding a place on countless best movies lists from publications around the world, and generally being viewed as yet another redefining Western by Leone. Basically, every movie made after titled Once Upon a Time In is homaging this movie, marking a time before and after the film when Westerns were made. And yet, it all came a little too late. Despite creating Once Upon a Time to be the capstone on his westerns, and maybe all westerns, Leone could still only find work making cowboy movies, going on to direct Joue la Testa, aka Duck You Sucker, aka A Fistful of Dynamite, aka Once Upon a Time in the Revolution in 1971, before finally being able to make his long-in-development dream project, Once Upon a Time in America in 1984, before passing away on April 30th, 1989 at the age of 60. never having enough time to make all his dream projects come true on screen, but permanently redefining what the Western means on film and what it meant in relation to the perception of America as a concept. Because by the end, the transcontinental train has finally arrived, pushed forward by corporate greed, but also bringing hope and progress. The West has been killed, but the America that springs up from its ashes has the hope of something greater. What we do with it is up to us. Thanks for watching today's video, and it's November, so you know what that means. It's time for me to talk about another Western. You might have picked up on a pattern that every November brings another Western, and specifically another Leone Western. In the past, I've covered every film on the Dollars trilogy, and now it's finally time to move on to Once Upon a Time in the West. Like I mentioned in the video, when I was younger and I first saw this movie, after I became a huge fan of Good, the Bad, and the Ugly and all the Dollars movies, I found this to be kinda hard to get into. A little too slow, a little too broad, a little too morally ambiguous, and it just didn't quite click with me the way that those other movies did. But in the time since, I've rewatched this movie multiple times, and every time it's just gotten better and better for me. And rewatching it this time really solidified it as a masterpiece for me. And a movie that absolutely stands alongside the Dollars trilogy as another amazing Leone Western. And also something that is totally its own thing too. It's sad, it's slow, it's mournful, it's elegiac, and it's also fun after that first hour. But it's a difficult tone, and I understand why some people might not really enjoy this film, and why others might think it's an absolute masterpiece that works on a totally different level from all his other movies. In any case, it was fascinating for me to unpack this film. Because once you really dig into what Leone was trying to do with it, and how it was quoting and homaging and then ending a lot of other stories and characters from previous Westerns, it all makes a lot more sense. This is the death of the Western, coming only a few years after Leone had finally brought it back to life. Of course, there is still Duck-You-Sucker in his filmography, but I'm a little more interested in moving on to Once Upon a Time in America and talking about other Westerns that aren't made by Leone. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Once Upon a Time in the West, where you would rank it within Leone's larger filmography, and any other Western you'd like for me to talk about on the channel. As always, a huge thank you to my patrons and members for their continued support, and if you'd like to be a patron or member, it's only $2 a month for early access to every video and exclusive monthly reviews voted on by patrons and members, with November's exclusive review talking about Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. So until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves and enjoying a great Western.